Kia ora, Richard. At the top here, just want to let you know that this is part two of a two-part series looking at surveying New Zealand. A couple of big studies. Part one was on the Church Life Survey, and today is looking at the recent Faith and Belief Survey. And we're going to be talking with Chris Clarke from Wilberforce Foundation about that. So let's jump in.
No mai, haere mai, welcome to More Than Theology, the Papa's Bible College podcast, and I'm excited today because today is a second part of a two-part series where we're looking at a couple of really interesting surveys that have been done in New Zealand recently, looking at the faith landscape here in this country. And we previously had Peter Lynham from the Church Life Survey, and today we have Chris Clarke with us, and he's going to be talking about the Faith and Belief Survey. Chris is the CEO of Wilberforce Foundation, and he's been CEO for all sorts of organizations. He's currently also CEO of Arrow Leadership, has been CEO in the past of World Vision, of a district health board in New Zealand, and worked in the health sector. He's studied at Oxford and is obviously a real guru, and I've just met him now, but he seems a lovely guy too, so I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation. So welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Yeah, kia ora, Richard. I think it's the first time I've been described as a guru. That probably wouldn't go down very well at home, I have to say.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, hey, Chris, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be involved with the Wilberforce Foundation.
So we'd been in the UK. I was coming back from the UK, trying to figure out really what the Lord was calling us to do next. Had a real heart for Aotearoa, for New Zealand, and for the gospel. And it was one of those sort of seemingly chance conversations, which you actually look back in hindsight and realise actually there was a thread. The Holy Spirit was in there somehow. Yeah. And it was just a chance comment from Ian Cooperis, who set up Wilberforce many years earlier, and said, "Hey, look, while you're trying to figure out what you're doing, why don't you come and do some work with us?" And that was probably about 5 years ago, and I haven't left, and it's been a really good decision. So I've loved being a part of the team. And we're now 120 different organisations. So it's quite a big organisation, and one that we quite deliberately don't tell people about, because what we want to do is keep the focus on the organisations that we support rather than on our own story. And that's kind of what I've been doing for the last few months.
Great. So tell us, one of the projects that Wilberforce is behind is the Faith and Belief Survey. Tell us a little bit about that survey, how it came into being, and what it's about.
So back in 2018, we saw a similar survey done in Australia, timed around the census. And what it was doing was trying to answer the questions that a census can never actually answer, such as, for people of faith, what attracts you to faith? For people who aren't of faith, what is a distraction from faith? And so on. So we wanted to explore that in a New Zealand context. So we commissioned the 2018 study using exactly the same organisation that had used the Australian study, and actually asking very similar questions so we could get a comparison. We very deliberately decided that we weren't going to provide a commentary. The idea was we'd ask the questions, see what New Zealanders said, and then allow others to come back and critique it or ask further questions. And that worked splendidly well, because what it led to was 5 years later a request to do the study yet again. And I think we've got a much more sophisticated study than we had 5 years ago. Much more involvement in the research community, many questions that relate to our context in New Zealand, which you wouldn't obviously see in Australia. So that was sort of the genesis of what's now becoming pretty much a 5-yearly gig.
Yeah. I personally really loved the first one, the 2018 study, referred to it a lot in my own teaching and thinking and all that sort of thing. Then this is the 2023, the hard copy version. And I'm very excited. I even, like a little fanboy, went up to the Auckland event. I'm based in Cambridge, so me and my brother, we got in the car together and went up there and it was a great event, and it's a great study. And I was so excited about it that I was recently at a dinner get-together with some of my friends, and I started talking about it, and they said, "Well, tell us more." And so I was actually, it was a neighbour's house. I ran back, I grabbed this, and this was being handed around the table, and people were poring over it. And there was like a little critique. Now, none of us are statisticians, but one of the people raised a question that I've heard one or two people say, which is there were 1,009 respondents, and it just intuitively doesn't seem like enough when you're trying to project from there to New Zealand society. So can you speak to a little bit about that kind of concern, Chris?
Yeah, look, absolutely. It's a great question. And your dinner party wasn't the first group to ask that question. We used a professional research firm who do this all the time. And so they were the ones that came up with the sample size and said, actually, with a sample of 1,000, provided that you adjust for ethnicity, for gender, for geography, and a whole lot of other factors, you can actually be very confident that the results will be sound. And so their calculation is that there's a 3% margin of error. In other words, we could have doubled that number, trebled that number, and probably not got more accurate results than we have. But it didn't end there. What they also did is they did a whole series of sort of focus groups. And what's really interesting when you look at the results is they're not out of line with what we're seeing coming through other research, such as the Barna World Vision research done a couple of years ago, looking at younger generations. So we can be pretty confident it's in line. We can be very confident with the sampling approach. One of the things that we did in 2023, which is different to 2018, which will appeal to the data geeks, is we realised in hindsight that we had underrepresented Pacifica and Maori and through our sampling technique. So we deliberately adjusted for that. So we're pretty confident that we've got a strong kind of data-based research result.
And that, I think that's so fantastic, because little old New Zealand, you get so used to relying on the American data, occasionally British data. It's so great to have a picture of New Zealand in this particular area. So really feel very grateful to you guys for the hard work you've put in. I want to pick up one of the key themes of the study, which seems to be that, yes, the adherence to formal religion is declining in New Zealand, but there remains a real interest in sort of spirituality, is often how it's framed. You know, I sometimes hear the phrase spiritual but not religious. Can you just talk to that a little bit in terms of what do you think the significance is of that particular trend and what it means for the church?
Richard, I think you've got to the absolute heart of the issue. So what we're seeing is 48% of New Zealanders say they have no faith affiliation at all. And we're seeing a decline across all age groups in terms of formal religious affiliation. But the big surprise number for us was that 81% of New Zealanders said they had some spiritual beliefs. Now, for some, it was simply that they believed in some higher purpose or an afterlife. For some, it was right through to that they've got a deep belief in a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. So 4 in 5 New Zealanders are saying they've got some awareness or some spiritual practice. Now, that really challenges the assumption I think a lot of us previously made, which is that New Zealand is largely a secular country. Well, in fact, we're not. What it's telling us is that we're pluralistic. In other words, that there's a whole set of expressions of spirituality. And the challenge for the church is that we no longer own, if you use that language, that market. There are many other forms of spiritualities, some of which are broadly recognizable to Christians, some of them which are not. But actually, we're living in a context where there is a sense of spirituality. And of course, the challenge for Christians is how do we engage with these other spiritualities in a way which is humble and is reflective, but at the same time points to our own understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus.
Yeah, and building off that too, one of the things that I've found really useful about both the 2018 and 2023 iterations of the study is this question around the warmth or coolness of Kiwis towards Christianity. And one other thing I found really interesting about that is because similarly to what you're saying, you know, this idea that we live in a secular country, when in fact it's pluralistic. I think similarly, there's an idea around that we tell ourselves as Christians in New Zealand that that everyone's against us, that society hates us, and it's a very kind of hostile picture that we build up. And I think that cultivates a siege mentality. When you look at the data, it looks like both in 2018 and 2023, what is it? 26% of non-Christian Kiwis are warm towards Christianity and 31% are cold towards Christianity. So that to me paints a more balanced picture that the wider culture is not hostile to the Christian faith. There perhaps is that element, but there's also an openness or at least a neutrality. Yeah, and that's surprising to me. I think that's different to what a lot of times we assume.
Yeah, I think you're right. And maybe that's the spirit of the age, that kind of in the very tribalized world in which we are living, it's easy to feel under siege. It's very easy to feel that there's a them and there's an us. But actually the study, as you say, doesn't point to that. That 1 in 4 New Zealanders are really open to a conversation about faith. And of course that begs the question, well, why isn't it happening? And the really interesting thing is there's some fairly familiar reasons why it doesn't happen. It is because, for a start, Christians are not in connection with their community. Many New Zealanders point out to the fact they have absolutely no idea what their local church does. They might drive past it every day to go to school or to go to work or go to the supermarket, but they have no understanding of what that building is actually doing in its community. So there's some real opportunities for us to actually get our story told, not to a hostile audience, but probably to a quizzical audience. And the important thing about that is recognizing that while we hold our story dear, it doesn't follow that they will hold our story dear. So a posture of humility and a posture of openness and a posture of engagement and a posture of connection is how we authentically engage with those 26% of people who are already kindly predisposed towards that conversation.
That's great. What for you are some of the standout findings of the survey?
There are quite a few. I think the biggest one for me is that the hopes and fears of people of faith and the hopes and fears of people not of faith are remarkably similar. And I think this is the great hope for Christians seeking to bring the gospel to Aotearoa, which is the hopes are around relationships, the hopes are around security, both financially for some, but particularly in terms of a hope for the future. For some, it's reflected in terms of their own wealth, but above all in a sense of relationships. Now, what's interesting is those hopes are shared by both people of faith and people not of faith. Then that begs the question, so what are people most fearful of? And what's coming through really interestingly is that most people are recognizing that they have good personal relationships with their immediate family, but are feeling a sense of disconnection with their wider community. Now, here's the thing. This is the thing I think that churches do so well, is that we're all about community. You know, you go to a church on Sunday, I sit at church on a Sunday morning, and as everyone strolls up to take communion, what I'm observing is people I'd never otherwise mix with, you know, from different generations, from different cultures, from different age groups and so on. And I'm part of this community that we call the body of Christ. That's the very thing that people are looking for, is a sense of community beyond my own immediate community.
How does it relate to the sort of crisis of loneliness you hear about? I hear about it globally, that there's this crisis. Are Kiwis lonely, or is this data saying, no, they're not lonely, but they want to be connected to something bigger? How do you interpret that?
So when we looked at the top three fears or longings, what came through for every generation except Generation Z, loneliness didn't figure in the top three, except for that Generation Z. Now, these are people born just before the turn of the century, just before the millennium, and they identified loneliness as one of their top three factors. Now, this is coming through in other evidence and other research in the health world and elsewhere. And we must, I think, ask ourselves the question, the impact of COVID in terms of how has that contributed to that sense of isolation and loneliness. But clearly, if we want to engage with that next generation of young people, people aged 18 to 28 years of age, we're going to need to address it in ways which actually address some of these issues around loneliness. And by creating connection, creating warmth, creating community.
Do you think the picture that we get through here is one of a sense of hopelessness amongst Kiwis, or not, or is it more complicated?
Yeah, great question, Richard. I think it is more complicated. I think we need to do a lot more research to fully understand the impact of COVID on people, and there's some early signs, but I think it's probably going to be 5 to 10 years before we fully understand what COVID did, not so much to people's physical health, but to their mental and emotional and spiritual health. But what we're seeing, I think, is some trends which are incredibly encouraging. So what we're seeing among young people out of the survey, and this is backed up by other surveys such as the Barna work, is that young people are probably the most open of any generation to conversations about spirituality, including Christianity, but not limited to Christianity. Now, the challenge of that is young people are also open to everything else as well. They're open to all sorts of experiences, sometimes to do with drugs, sometimes to do with all sorts of things. So it's not that there's just a warmth or an openness to Christianity, it's an openness to absolutely everything. Now, that gives us an opportunity, but also gives us a responsibility. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is perhaps more a challenge, which is that the way that we have often grown our churches is through it being passed down through the generations. grandparents to parents to grandchildren and so on. And a lot of the way that we've done church has assumed, for example, a Sunday school or something equivalent. What we're seeing with the big decline in attendance, formal attendance with religion, is that passing down the message, I think, is going to get weaker and weaker and weaker. So we need to find new ways of engaging with people directly, not through the family. So I think that's a sort of a countervailing trend. Now, the third trend is that we're seeing is, in terms of overall numbers, very significant support for the church from migrant communities, from Chinese, from Filipino, from other parts of particularly Asia. And in many ways, they are supporting the growth of the church or sustaining numbers in churches. Often we've seen them as sort of an adjunct to the work of the church. So clearly engaging in really meaningful ways with these communities of recent migrants is going to be very significant to seeing the gospel flourishing here.
That's great. There's one bit of datum, I guess, from the 2018 survey that I referred to a wee bit with some of the students that we have at Pathways. And that was around the blockers to Christianity. So the sort of barriers that non-believing Kiwis have towards the Christian faith. And what came through in 2018 was the church's stance towards homosexuality, teaching on hell, and the issue of suffering. Those were sort of the big blockers. In the new survey, you've taken a different approach to that kind of area. Can you explain some of the rationale behind that?
Yeah, so we put together a research panel of researchers across New Zealand, and they guided us on every question. And this is probably the one question that we had the biggest debate on. When we asked it in 2018, it was a prompted question. So what happened is, what are some of the blockages to you exploring faith? And people had a list of things. That almost invariably meant people ticked something on that list. Whereas the advice of our researchers is, no. Ask it as an open question and allow people to, whatever prompts in them, to write down. So that was the change. Now, it's very interesting. It did mean that some topics such as teachings on hell, role of woman, LGBTQI+, didn't figure as prominently in terms of these belief blockers. But at a higher level, what was coming through are some fairly familiar critiques. Hypocrisy, intolerance. There were some concerns about particular teaching of the church, and that might have picked up on some of those themes that were there. A lack of transparency in terms of how we engage and tell our story, and so on. The interesting thing, when you look at those 6 sort of top blockers to faith, Karen Kemp speaks about this in her commentary on the study. 5 of those 6 reflect a poorly embodied gospel, in her words. In other words, it's us not doing our story well, either in terms of our posture or in terms of our position, which means we can actually address that. We can actually tackle these issues around hypocrisy, around judgmentalism, around a lack of tolerance, around a lack of transparency, and so on. So they were the big themes that came through in the 2023 study, and frankly, probably shouldn't surprise too many people.
Speaking of surprises, were there surprises for you?
There was one. Oh, there were probably more, but the one that really comes to mind for me, and I'm thinking about quite deeply, is a question that we asked around, essentially, what, being a person of faith, what does that mean for you? And up until the year 2000, so anyone born before year 2000, will answer that question in terms of faith enables them to care for others, to make an impact on society. So it's a very outward-looking faith. From 2000 onwards, there's almost a moral therapy that creeps in there. So in other words, for the Generation Z, this age 18 to 28, what does faith do for you? It enables me to feel more secure, me to feel more better. So it's more of an internalized expression. Now, I think we need to think deeply about that. That if our gospel is, if the way we're telling our story is essentially as a moral therapeutic story, we're not telling the full gospel. And yet at the same time, it is wonderful that the gospel actually speaks to my condition and my situation. But that's the one I guess I'm most thoughtful about, is a very sharp shift in terms of what the gospel means for New Zealanders. And I do wonder whether that's because we're not telling the gospel story as fully as we need to.
That's really interesting. You know, I think of Acts 17, where Paul is preaching in Athens, and he starts with, you know, their statue to an unknown God. He ends with speaking about Jesus, and I guess perhaps the gospel challenge for us in Aotearoa is to find those starting points. And the starting point might be that sort of moralistic, therapeutic approach, and then figuring out how to build that bridge all the way through to Jesus. Probably not in one sermon, but maybe over a process and so forth. Yeah. No, really, really good. Go ahead.
It's also, Richard, a really good reason for why we need places like Pathways, because actually we need to form people. In other words, people come to faith, but then we want them to grow in their faith and grow in their depth of understanding. And part of that is actually having a rich, formed theology. It doesn't end in the classroom. Obviously, you then want to take that theology and apply it in practice. But I think this is a case in point where if there's a challenge for the church, it is to make sure that we are telling the gospel story well. And the gospel story is not just a story of personal salvation. Obviously, that's a key part of the story. But God so loved the world. So this is where the gospel needs to speak to the world, not just to my own individual situation. And that's where good theology comes into the conversation.
Yeah, and thanks for the little plug there for Pathways. And I think for myself studying theology, it's something we need to tell our wider society. It's something that I need to hear too. I want to know that the gospel touches on all aspects of my life and not just say my future destiny or some sort of spiritual component that feels like it's just a part of the picture. And so I think what resonates with the wider culture is also what's going to resonate with ourselves. So yeah, I think that's a really helpful point. So thanks, Chris. This is a great resource. Like I said, I really love it. How are you finding people are using it? Both the 2018 and the 2023 study?
Well, in all sorts of ways. We've done a whole series of workshops with church ministers and with parachurch organisations sort of talking about the study. We've brought in commentators. That's leading to a lot of people asking more questions. I was talking to Kevin Ward, a very well-known academic theologian, recently retired. Well, he's come out of retirement. He'd been so prompted by the study, he's going to write a book on it. And this is exactly what we wanted to see, is we are not the experts in terms of interpreting the data. You know, what we're trying to do is, this is our gift to the church. Here is some data you may or may not find helpful. It will probably beg more questions than we can answer, and that's what we hope will happen. So you talked to Peter Lyman, a few weeks ago. I mean, Peter is just a champion for this kind of thing, and I know Peter's mind is racing about all sorts of things. That's what we hope will happen. It's a conversation that carries on. How we're trying to help that conversation is that most people aren't data geeks, and most people would probably watch Netflix in preference to reading a survey on the state of the church. We understand that. So what we've done is we've produced some resources to help church leaders work with their congregations and for Christian organisations to work with their communities in terms of what the data might mean for them. So you can go to the website. It's faithandbeliefstudynz.org. And on the website, we've got the studies, including a very detailed study, which really will appeal to the data geeks. It's got the really heavy database. And then alongside that, a couple of resources that churches and parachurch organisations can use to think through, well, if this is what's happening in society, and remember, this was a study not just of Christians. We deliberately went out to all New Zealanders. So we're getting uncut feedback from people who are not of faith. Well, if this is our world that we're operating in, how best might we engage with that world?
That's great. That's great. So that website again, Chris?
faithandbeliefstudynz.org.
Great. Thank you so much. Hey, just to round off this conversation, Chris, I'd love you to, paint a bit of a picture, a vision. You're obviously really invested in this, believe in what you're doing, and you've got a bit of a picture here of where New Zealand society is at, and perhaps some ideas about how, as the people of God in Aotearoa, we ought to be responding, proclaiming and embodying the gospel. So paint a picture for me, like what would you love to see the church doing, being, how might it change to respond to the place that God has put us in this type of place?
Well, big question. When I look out at my church, which is fairly typical of most churches across New Zealand, lovely, lovely people, but most of them have got a hair colour like me. They're grey. We're an ageing church. In fact, the church across New Zealand is older than the average demographic of New Zealanders. So we've got a challenge, and as Mike Crudge says, our challenge is to help the church grow younger. So how do we help a church grow younger? Well, at a very simple level, it's by engaging in the issues that actually are top of mind for young people. We've talked about loneliness, so actually creating a place where people can find a home, where they can find a community, but it doesn't end there. One of the other concerns that many young people raise is they don't expect to make old bones. They expect the climate and this world to burn up well before they reach even my age currently. And so in terms of our gospel, a gospel which is rich enough that speaks into not just my own situation, but actually the situation of the globe. You know, I think about this particularly in relation to a command I think we've neglected, which is to steward creation. So what I'd love to see is churches that are engaging in these questions of essentially an eco-theology. How do we take our stewardship responsibility as well? And here's the really neat thing. Again, wearing a Wilberforce hat, we work very closely with Aotearoa, which is one of the few Christian-based environmental agencies in the world. And they have this wonderful thing called Eco Church, where they're encouraging churches to become a part of this movement, which takes its theology seriously, takes the theology out of the classroom and applies it to actually how do we live our lives in a way that cares for creation. That's the kind of thing that we'd love to see. We've been doing a lot of work with young people in this regard. They are flocking to church as a consequence of that. Why? Because we're concerned about the things that they're concerned about. By being concerned about the things that they're concerned about, then we get the opportunity or the privilege to tell the bigger story, which is that ultimately we don't have a disembodied God somewhere out there. We actually have a God who deeply cares for us and wants to be in a relationship with us and deeply cares for his planet and is asking us to look after it on his behalf. I mean, it's a compelling message. So for me, it is actually finding ways of connecting with younger people, because I think it's our biggest challenge, to help the church grow younger, but in ways that points to the bigger story.
Yeah, I love that. I think, often as evangelicals, there is, I should say, among evangelicals, recognizing that, the church is broader. But among evangelicals, there's often a real emphasis on youth. It doesn't always translate to young people showing up. But I wonder if the emphasis has sometimes been on the methods, the programs. What you're talking about is, but what are the issues that we're engaging? And so I think that that's some really good food for thought. I know with my own students, we do an assignment in one of our classes on eschatology and climate change and trying to think through how do we speak to climate change through that kind of a lens, because most of our students are that generation that are particularly concerned about that. So thanks, Chris. I mean, I think that's a really invigorating, inspiring kind of vision and also a real challenge. And that's pretty much what the Faith and Belief study is. And so I encourage you all to get your hands on it. Go to the website, as Chris pointed out, get your hands on those resources that kind of break it down for those who aren't wanting to read the whole thing. And let's start really using that data to make better informed choices and I guess engage the culture that we're in and that God has placed us in a more winsome and wise way. So thanks so much, Chris. It's been a real joy to have you here.
Fantastic, Richard. Thanks for the privilege. Well done.
Ka kite anō.
Blessings.